Hello, everyone. I hope everybody is enjoying this rather mild evening. My name is Kelly here at the Bloomingdale Public Library. And before we get going, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to come and enjoy this Zoom webinar. Um, um, but I would, before I introduce the host, I'd like to tell you about our upcoming Zoom programs that we have in the pipe. On November 18th at 6:30, we will learn all about the latest news about the planet Venus, hosted by our friend Michelle Nichols. Please go online and call us to register. On November 1st at 6:30 p.m., we will also have another Zoom program, this time on the art and life of Roy Lichtenstein. That will also be hosted by another pal of ours, Jeff Measure. Please go online or call us to register for that one as well. Now, tonight's guest speaker has hiked, biked, and paddled enough historic trails and roads and rivers in America and Britain to circle the globe. He has photographed all 2,400 Illinois cities and towns. He's been featured on the front pages of major newspapers, and he was described by WGN Radio as, and I'm quoting here, a walking encyclopedia of Illinois. Please welcome John Lynn of Peoria.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks to those of you who are out there for the program tonight. Yeah, I am an Illinois towns guy. I kind of identify as a small towns person. My parents grew up in small towns. I'm from the Peoria area, but went to high school at Dunlap, which when I went there was a little farm town. Now it's grown a whole lot, so it's all different now. But the smaller kinds of towns are the ones that I gravitate to around the state. And it's been 39 years now. I've been taking pictures in Illinois towns. And you may be aware that I've, for a number of years, presented a program called Main Street, Illinois. Well, I've got so much material. I needed to have some other vehicles for working in that material. So this program came about as kind of a prequel to Main Street. The rise of Main Street, Illinois, how towns got started, and that sort of thing. So that's what we'll talk about tonight. If you have some questions that come up, it's probably best to hang on to them till afterwards. We'll see how we are on time then. If you've attended my programs before, you know that I'm usually pushing the limits on that, but I'd be happy for questions afterwards. Well, as I drive around the state, yeah, I do notice small towns, and I always, well, I get pictures of how you're welcomed at towns. Mascoutah, that's down by Scott Air Force Base, down by Belleville, down that direction, and it's was one time the population center of North America, or sorry, of the United States, but that has changed and it's moved farther west since then, but a nice town. I also notice who it is that does the welcoming. Sometimes it's the town itself, sometimes it's the Main Street merchants, as at Franklin Grove. Down in the south at Christopher, it's the churches that welcome you to town. Sometimes it's the community organizations. Sometimes it's just the mayor, whatever. And I like to see how they portray themselves to people just traveling through who don't know anything about the place. What do they want me to know about that town? Haynesville, you may be familiar with, Lake County's oldest village. It was really known as a speed trap for years and years and years. I think it's outgrown that. But I don't have a whole lot of knowledge on Haynesville other than what they show on that and the article I read years ago about it being a serious speed trap. Waterloo, down in the St. Louis area on the Illinois side, is gosh, if I had to name one of the top 20 towns in the state, that would be one of them, actually be one of the top five. I'm really impressed. An old German town that's prosperous. It's far enough from St. Louis that there's no crime. They've got great eateries, great bars, a nice library that books my programs. Well, they're the sister city of, well, whatever, how it's pronounced in Germany. But they don't need to promote themselves at all because that's just a great place. Everybody in that area knows it. Kankakee, a little different matter. They need to do a little promoting. That town has fallen on hard times in modern years. I noticed that they bragged that it's a Wi-Fi community. Well, gosh, that'll take us a long way into the future. It's not exactly futuristic at this point, but Kankakee's right there with us. Um, if you're interested in geographical landmarks, you probably know about Chestnut, Illinois, and Logan County. That is at the geographical center of the state of Illinois. So to people like me, that's a big deal. It's a destination. Although you won't really see anything once you get there, it's just a tiny little town. But it's sort of like Charles Mound in the north, the highest elevation in the state, or Fort Defiance Point down by Cairo, the lowest elevation in the state. These kind of things are interesting to people like me. Welcome to Utica. It's one of these gateway communities. They know it's not, a destination, but you're going to have to go through there on the way to the place that you're going to, Starved Rock. I always wonder if people should advertise themselves as a gateway like that. Like, you don't really want to be here, but you're going to have to go through here. Why don't you stop and spend a few dollars, that sort of thing. But Utica happens to be a very nice town, and I do recommend it as a place to stop in and have lunch or something on your way to Starved Rock. Nice town. Bradford is a town in Stark County that's the right size. It used to be in my high school basketball conference. In a previous life, I called on the bank in Bradford. Great folks, nice little town. Uh, I'm not sure how historic it is. I mean, every town is historic in a way. It was established in 1869. And I don't really know much. I'm a history guy, and yet I don't really know how much history there is in Bradford. But I do question it, sort of like the gateway thing. Do you really want to advertise that all you've got is the past? So all the towns that, like Crete is another one, that refers itself as historic. Well, they add in a modern village with old-fashioned values, so that kind of straightens it out. But when towns talk too much about their past or how they're looking forward to their future, you're always wondering, well, how much is here right now? Sometimes not a lot. Bradford's okay. You'll learn a few things from these welcoming signs. Saybrook in East Central Illinois. Its motto, it's a city of shade and water. And I don't know how that came about, but a July day, that's just what would be ideal. Chatsworth, also East Central Illinois. I didn't know till the last time I was through there. It's now calling itself the bluebird capital of the world. And I think that's probably better than having been the site of one of the worst railroad accidents in American history, the Chatsworth train wreck, which was, 85 people or so were killed and a couple hundred injured. So bluebirds are better than train wrecks for sure. And other towns let you know what they want to be remembered for. Arcola, that's south of Champaign. Uh, I guess, well, as you can read on there, if you can, Illinois' largest Amish settlement. So that's what's taking us into the future. And you'll notice in the background that the Amish like Dairy Queens and McDonald's and all that sort of thing too. Actually, I run into them in places like that. So I guess they do. The place on the right is down by East St. Louis, Brooklyn, Illinois. There's also an East Brooklyn and a West Brooklyn, and another town called Brooklyn in, I think, Brown or Schuyler County. This one is near East St. Louis, America's oldest Black incorporated community. And as it happens, it's the one town in Illinois that I've been kicked out of. There's not much to the place, and I think the only two businesses when I was first through there, like 35 years ago, a couple of strip joints. And I was out on the public sidewalk taking a picture down the street of what you see in Brooklyn, Illinois. And apparently somebody complained. And so a cop came along and told me that if I didn't stop taking pictures, they were going to throw my camera in the weeds and they'd throw me in jail. So I didn't stand on my rights. sort of like a bicyclist. You don't want to stand in your rights in front of a car. Uh, it was time to move on, so I did. But that's Brooklyn, if you're interested. Uh, Cornland, the one and only cornland in the world, apparently. Certainly the only one they found in America. And I don't know why they'd call it cornland anyplace else. We have a couple of other unique towns with names. Farmer City, Illinois is said to be the only town named Farmer City. And Moweaqua, Illinois, which of course is a native word, is the only Moweaqua in the world. Walnut Grove is an appealing little place. It's a tiny place, but it's God's country, so that's got to be a good spot. Um, and part of the appeal of small towns is finding out famous people who've come from those places. That's kind of a theme in this program, talking about who comes from where. And I'm always rooting for people from small towns. They're often underdogs in the larger world, and I'm happy anytime they succeed. Well, for years, I drive through Ramsey, Illinois on the way to the Mount Vernon Education Conference where I spoke there 19 years in a row or something. And I kept seeing the sign, Village of Ramsey, the home of Tex Williams. And finally, one day I decided, hey, it's time to stop in and see Tex Williams. Upon inquiry, I found out, well, he had already died at that point, or he passed, as we say in modern times. So he's not available for a visit, and I didn't even check out which house he grew up in, if that's still standing, since I couldn't talk to the guy anymore. Anyway, his career hasn't gone very far since 1985. He stays in bed all day and does nothing. But he came from there originally. So now you know. They've got a backup plan at Lerna in Coles County. That's near Charleston. I had read of this wizard of a dog, Dave the Math Dog at Lerna. So the last time I was through there, I decided it's time to check out Dave the Math Dog. I've been impressed in Marshall, Missouri. There was a genius dog that lived there that was studied by PhDs from multiple countries. He could respond to commands in 35 languages or something. Well, you can't visit with him either. He's already passed. And it turns out when I asked some locals, I can't see Dave the Math Dog anymore because he too has gone the way of all dogs. I don't know how he met his demise. I'm hoping that that golf cart over there on the left is not a clue. I hope he just had you know, passed in the night. But there's a backup plan at Lerna, and I was happy to learn about this at Lerna. The guys I was talking to about Dave the Math Dog said, well, just down here at so-and-so's workshop along the main street there, there are a couple of soda machines, and they've been certified as the fastest soda machines in the world. Now, I have a little question about that. If somebody's got time to travel all around the world and time soda machines, they got more time than the rest of us do. And I don't know how you check it with all these other places unless somebody does that. But they said, yeah, it's fast. And I don't know, the machines had appeared in the Tonight Show, had some big unveiling somewhere where fastest soda machine. So I put in some quarters and pushed the button, and true. Immediately when I touched the button, a can of soda came out. So it was really quick. I was impressed by that. Don't know if the claim is true, but these were fast machines. So when it comes to Lerna and maybe some other places, sure, come to Lerna for the smart dog, stay in Lerna for the fast soda machines. They've got them. And if you're curious, there are some stupid dogs in Illinois too. Florence, Illinois, on the Illinois River down in Pike County. Yeah, they got old dogs, young dogs, several stupid dogs. Please drive slowly when you go through Florence. Well, I enjoy these kind of things, and it's always a nice, welcoming sign to a place like Good Hope, a nice place to come home to. It's hard to top that. Although there's always going to be that wiseacre town up the road or down the road that says, welcome to Buckner. If you lived here, you would be home now. So I guess that's the comeback to that one. Small towns in particular have a little bit of a complex. They know there's not a lot to see there, not a lot to do, just not a lot happening. but they always try to give you the idea that there's more there than meets the eye. Little York, the little village with a big heart. Similar with Smithshire in west central Illinois, a small town with big country pride. Well, you get the idea. Now, when it gets down to a population of 4 people, there aren't as many claims that people can make, and not too many people to make those claims to. Speaking of two, when the population drops to two, as it is at Van Petten, the only person you have to talk to is your spouse, and they probably haven't talked to you in years. I've heard every story you've got, so you've got a limited audience there. And no town wants to be this town or a town like it. There was once a town called Held in Marshall County, which is north of Peoria, say 40 miles. Um, it had it had a coal yard, it had a lumber yard, a couple of general stores, a blacksmith shop, the usual story. There was a train depot there. In fact, the rail line went right down that utility line that you see heading east in the picture. But that has all disappeared. And Held is no longer out there. There are a lot of towns out there that are no longer out there. Many are no longer listed on the map. 40 years ago, when I first started traveling around to visit these towns, Held was still on the map, and there was no reason for it even then. But some of these towns hang on the map for much longer than they hang on in real life. There's no secret here. A lot of Illinois towns, in fact, the majority of Illinois towns have been dying for at least the last 100 years, if not longer. And I will have a program on, I guess, the decline of Illinois small towns, but that's for another time. We're going to talk about living towns tonight. And some Illinois towns may also be in decline from where they were 100 years ago, but they put a pretty good face on it. At least on a sunny day with blue skies, a place like Avon in Fulton County looks like a nice little spot. Main Street Cafe there on the left. You see the water tower, Casey's down the street, which dominates small towns in Illinois and elsewhere, and their Main Street buildings, which include a couple of taverns, and that's downtown Avon right there. Hinckley, you may be more familiar with in DeKalb County. That still looks like a pretty going town. Again, that's probably not what it once was, but it still looks good to me. And among those that look good to me, one that I'm always impressed with is Amboy in Lee County. If you're familiar with it, you probably have the same opinion. I would list that among the top, say, 20 or 25 towns in the state, very early on in that listing. They seem to have some industry there. They've got some income. They have good schools. And when you look down the main street of Amboy, like all these other towns, you're really looking back in time. It's sort of a time machine. The buildings that you see have all been there 150 years, maybe even 160 years, going back to the heyday of Illinois small towns. They don't tear down buildings and build new ones along Main Street in most towns. If they build new, they do tear some down once in a while and some burn down. But when they put in new buildings, it's usually out at on the main highway a couple miles away because there's been a bypass put around the town. Or if you've seen the situation where an interstate misses a town by 3 or 4 miles, all the new businesses, the gas stations, the restaurants, eateries, motels, all this kind of stuff is on that section of highway out to the interstate, and the old downtown, the old Main Street languishes. Well, Amboy is in good shape, but yeah, we're looking back to the heyday of Illinois small towns. Um, I refer to the golden age of Main Street being basically from the end of the Civil War to our involvement starting in World War One. And you could shift that 50 years or so forward or backward depending on the town. Every town has a slightly different timeline, But if we're going to talk about towns in general, that's the period between the Civil War and World War One when these towns were in their prime and really functioning. So, a few words to describe the people of that era. And you'll see the face there again later. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's one of Bloomingdale's own. He was born in Bloomingdale, so we'll talk about him later. Before the Great Migration to the cities and suburbs, the majority of Americans still lived in small towns and rural places. Many grew up on farms, as did my parents. When they moved on to the larger world, they carried the traditions and values of Main Street with them into every new field of endeavor. And during that time, the culture of Main Street, Illinois, was America's culture. There's no question about that in that era. So, a few words to describe the architecture of what you see along Main Street. Um, the architecture reflected the prosperity, pride, and confidence and optimism of these communities. The owners, builders stamped their buildings with their names and a loud, clear date to defy time and gravity. It was a public message that their buildings, their businesses, and their communities were here to stay. And where those are preserved, you'll see it was a remarkable era. I'm impressed that Lanark in Carroll County uh, can come up with the money to maintain these buildings. But this is the way they would have looked. And something I want you to notice in particular on these buildings, I mentioned the names of the store owner or the builder and the dates. Well, here's the Henry Stover building. That's from 1887, and the A. Heath building from 1881. So in both of those cases, we're talking about buildings that are over 130 years old. Um, and some of these on Main Street date back to the 1860s. Most of them, you start seeing more of them in the 1870s and then a lot in the 1880s. It's also true that sometimes I was in El Paso, Illinois, the other night for a program, and I was taking pictures of the buildings like these, and they were all dated 1894. And I learned why in the course of giving the program. I was talking to one of the local fellows, and he said, well, we had a fire that burned down El Paso in 1893. So you have to figure that into the history of some of these towns. Been fires in almost every town, not just Chicago. And that's so El Paso rebuilt in 1894, and all the buildings say 1894. Well, they constructed impressive buildings, things that were meant to stand out to your eye, meant to impress. Um, Buildings that you just wouldn't see built in that way today. Maybe a church like the one in Quincy there, they would, build churches pretty much the same way. Actually, they don't. They don't build churches that nice anymore. They look more standard than a impressive place like that one. Um, Everybody had an opera house back in those days before there were movie theaters, before vaudeville was entertaining. They, well, they built opera houses, and even the smallest of towns had some kind of an opera house. They called it that, and maybe it was mainly vaudeville entertainment or other people who would occasionally come to town and perform. Maybe the high schools would perform their plays there. Don't know. But there were a lot of them out there, and they're still there. 1893 seemed to be a big year for them. This is the one in Clinton. You notice it's a modern day sports bar underneath, but the old building is still there. And look at this one, a little town called Camp Point. Bailey's Opera House from, what's that say, 1893 again. And the only reason you heard of Camp Point is if you're a Cub fan, you will remember Rick Russell was a great pitcher for the Cubs for several years. He also had a brother that played Major League Baseball. They were from Camp Point, and perhaps they attended some event at Bailey's Opera House along the way. Impressive stuff. Here's another one in a little town west of Peoria called Elmwood. Nice little town. And it's not a nice building at this point, although it's still open, again, as a sports bar. But again, up at the top, you'll see the name Gabriel and Graham. and the date 1896. So I'm glad there's a functioning business to keep that building going, and it's the kind of thing. The Crossroads building, B Mint, similar thing. When I first visited B Mint, this was a Ben Franklin five and dime store down here, but that disappeared a long time ago, and I don't know who occupies that building today, but an impressive building from 1897. Princeton, Illinois is a very nice town. It's right along I-80. And there must have been some money in Princeton back in the day because there are some beautiful old houses. And the Bureau County Genealogical Society operates out of the Fiber building of 1904. And that is well preserved because of that. So you see these things. Xenia, coal glaciers from 1915. It seems to be a defunct business now, but in 1950 it must have reigned over Xenia. I mean, like a king would reign over the town. It was the biggest building in town and must have been the home to an impressive department store or something in Xenia, Illinois. Um, Banks probably tell the best story that you can see in small towns. And if you want to tell the story of small towns, banking is a way to describe it. Notice the Ziebold building in Redbud, Illinois. That's from 1895 and was an impressive building. Well, the idea for banks was to be the first one into these new developing, emerging towns in Illinois. And as the tide rose, they'd benefit from the prosperity of that town. And Redbud is a very impressive town, and it may not be as prosperous as it once was, but I know they still have a municipal band that plays in the bandstand on Wednesday evenings in the summer. And it's a visually impressive town even now when you figure the Ziebold building into it. Well, here's another one, impressive bank building, no longer a bank building, but at Geneseo, which is another town that I'd list in the top 20 or 25 in Illinois. I need to do a program on just my top 25 towns in Illinois, but Geneseo would be right there at the top of the list. Settled by New Yorkers, and while a lot of downtowns have languished, every business is occupied, every storefront is open, and I can't say how well they're doing, but they're doing, and that's more than a lot of towns can say. Here's another impressive one. I haven't been able to get a date on this old bank building in Polo, Illinois, but obviously it dates from the day and would have dominated Main Street in its day. Now, what it's used for, it's not a bank, but still a very impressive building. Well, yeah, banks wanted to get on the rising tide of prosperity in these emerging towns, but that also meant that they rode the ebbing tides. Mill Shoals sounds like it would have a tide coming in and out at Mill Shoals, but the tide went out a long time ago. This was the bank at Mill Shoals. It opened in 1909, which was well, it would soon be a difficult time because the Depression, it had 20 years of operation before the Depression, and it closed, and I presume it's been closed ever since. But because these were, banks want to look like sturdy institutions where you'd want to put your money, they were often the nicest, most enduring buildings in these towns, even though they've been closed for 100 years. They're the ones that are most recycled as other businesses. At Millwood, it's the post office. At Riddick, it's a bar called the Banker's Pub. At Indianola, it's the town museum. Moments, the old parish bank, is now City Hall. At Hudson, Illinois, it's the police department. At Oakford, Illinois, the old bank from 1911 is a private residence today. At Woodland, the building's not open, but it's a good place to put a Pepsi machine on the sidewalk out front. In Rochester, Illinois, down by Springfield, appropriately enough, it's a coin shop for coin collectors and all. And at Seneca, along the Illinois River, it's a sandwich shop. And a lot of times you see them as restaurants of one kind or another, at least for a while. And if banks are really patient, they may be banks again. At Warren, Illinois, which is another visually impressive town, the Apple River State Bank has expanded into a Warren office, which operates out of the old bank building that closed years and years ago. So good for the Apple River State Bank to take over the old bank building. Other places, the old bank buildings are still vacant and still waiting for somebody to make use of it. And those days have probably come and gone at Harvell, rather, Donovan, Illinois, Rio, Illinois, those kind of places. All right, I'm going to have four different installments of a little section of the program on everyone comes from somewhere. And again, I like to talk up people from small towns who have accomplished something, and I'll refer to several of them in these different segments this evening. There's a village called Coatesburg. It's down by Quincy in Adams County. 150 people today, even though the sign out front says 250, and it's probably less than 150 now. That was 2020. So there's not a lot to photograph in the town. But there's a guy that came from there. His name was Dr. William S. Gray. He was dean of the University of Chicago School of Education. He was also an executive at Scott Forsman and Company Publishers. He wrote the Dick and Jane series, by which an estimated 80% of American children learned to read in the 1950s. I would be one of those. I remember See Spot Run, all these simple phrases. And if you're a baby boomer, chances are, if you can read this, you can thank Dr. Gray, the father of reading, who came from a little place that wasn't as small then, but it was probably small comparatively to other towns, Coatesburg, Illinois. We'll move to a place a little closer to home for you here. I always like to put in some hometown person, and I have to admit, I had never heard of this guy, but then you might have to know special things about the banking industry to know this guy. Yeah, I'm happy that Bloomingdale is the home of the Bloomingdale Public Library. That's been good to me through the years. With a population of 22,382 in 2020, you'd expect people to be going forth and accomplishing things. Well, this guy did it early. Sorry, I can't pronounce his name, Rathje, something like that. Anyway, civic-minded lawyer, banker, and philanthropist. As I was telling Kelly before the program, I've always wanted to become a philanthropist someday, but it's not quite working out on at least on my schedule. Anyway, civic-minded lawyer, banker, and philanthropist who founded the Mutual National Bank of Chicago, later merged with the LaSalle Bank, and he founded the Chicago City Bank and Trust Company. Active in many civic and professional organizations, he was president of the Transportation Association of America, president of the American Bankers Association, president of the Illinois Bankers Association, and a member of the Chicago Planning Commission. His philosophy of success, 5 words: fairness, frankness, foresight, force, and faith. I don't know about the force part there, but I like that he worked in frankness since his first name is Frank. It had to work for the guy, right? Well, so there's your Bloomingdale hometown hero for this evening, and I hope there's a plaque somewhere where he don't. I noticed at Wikipedia that he donated to all kinds of organizations and parks and so forth. So hopefully you've seen his name on a plaque, and if not, you'll look him up and consider what he's accomplished. Meanwhile, we'll head down to the southern end of the state to visit Cobden, Illinois, in Union County, home of the apple knockers. They grow apples in the area, and kids' summer, or I guess autumn job would have been working part-time at the apple orchards, knocking apples out of the trees and picking them up. So their high school team was known as the Apple Knockers. But that's not why I bring them up. It was a railroad town, like so many Illinois towns. It was named for an Englishman who had apparently stumbled upon Cobden, Illinois at some point in his travels. And they were impressed. But it's the hometown of a woman that you probably haven't heard of. Her name was Agnes Ayers. She was a Hollywood actress in the early days. And while you probably haven't heard of her, I bet you have seen her because her big film was when she played opposite Rudolph Valentino in The Sheik. And at some film festival or sometime you probably learned of Rudolph Valentino and seen clips from The Sheik, and therefore you have seen Agnes Ayres. But Agnes, the whole rest of the town was superseded by fame and of their Apple Knockers basketball team in 1964. That was a huge thing for Illinois basketball fans. The whole high school only had 45 kids, and I think almost every boy in the high school was on the basketball team. And they played Pekin when Pekin was a real power in the 1960s. This is 1964. They played for the state championship. It was sort of like what Hebron won back in 52 and what Hoosiers, the movie, was all about in Indiana in 1953 or 54. They almost did it. They came within 5 points or so of beating Pekin, which would have been a great thing. Now, Pekin's only 20 miles downriver from where I'm sitting, well, maybe 30. And I didn't feel bad about at all about rooting against Pekin and rooting for the Apple Knockers. What a wonderful thing it was. Well, some of you have probably been to Dixon, and it calls itself the Petunia City. It was Ronald Reagan's boyhood home. He was born elsewhere. His family moved around a bit, but he considered Dixon his boyhood home, where he went to high school and all that. It was the home of, well, it was named for a guy named John Dixon that operated the ferry across the Rock River. And this nice old hotel, that was his hotel. The local, should I call them Indian tribes or native tribes? We know the same people. They called him Nachusa because of his beard. And that meant buffalo in their language. And that hotel was the Nachusa House. But there's another person from Dixon. You'd think having a president call your town home would be enough for any town. But Dixon has another person who did something remarkable. You're not going to recognize the name. He was of Swedish stock, and his family name changed a couple of times along the way. You notice he went to Dixon High School. There was a Dixon College at the time. He was a professional. He was a pharmacist. Well, the first name change for the family went from Olafson to Walgren. And that's probably going to start giving you a clue. The next change was to Walgreen. And yes, he was the founder of the Walgreens chain all across America. There are thousands of them. And it all started with the one in Dixon that Olafson started. There was some family relation that started the Rexall chain that doesn't exist anymore, or they were absorbed by another one. And I don't know if there is a family feud going on there or not, but I think Olafson was a pretty successful gentleman. There's a town called Durand in Winnebago County. That's where Rockford is. It calls itself the Village of Volunteers because the first rural volunteer fire department in Illinois was formed there. Today, a town of roughly 1,400 people. There was a famous woman, and maybe you will have heard of her, but probably not. Her name was Ellen Gates Starr, born in Durand in 1859. She became a lifelong teacher, social reformer, and activist who championed many causes. In 1889, she and Jane Addams, that you've heard of, co-founded Hull House to help immigrants and the poor in Chicago. In 1929, complications from surgery to relieve a spinal abscess left her paralyzed from the waist down. So in 1931, when Jane Addams was the acclaim of the world and received the Nobel Peace Prize for humanitarian work, Ellen Gates Starr retired to a convent in New York. She died there as an invalid in 1940. So she never really got the acclaim of history that Jane Addams did. But that's another nice function of small towns, hometowns. They'll look after their people. They're proud of their sons and daughters who go off and accomplish things, even if they don't get quite as much credit. They'll do the promoting. Nearly 100 and, well, what would it be? 175 years, 185 years since she was, um, well, we're going back to 1859. I was counting from 1840. Still a long ways back, but they're still willing to remember and promote her in her hometown. I like that. All right. Another town that I like, I mentioned Elmwood in Peoria County, is named for the beautiful stand of elm trees. Unfortunately, most of those came down in a tornado about 15 years ago, but Elmwood has rebuilt. It's a very nice community. And there was a famous person from Elmwood. He was the most famous sculptor in the state of Illinois ever. And if you've been to Loudon State Park, you've seen the Black Hawk statue overlooking the Rock River. It's 40 feet high or 39 feet high. So, yeah, you're going to be impressed by that. If you've attended the University of Illinois, you'll remember the alma mater statue. Um, to thy happy children of the future, those of the past, send greetings. Well, both of those were works of this guy from Elmwood. Here's another one in Chicago. It's huge. This only captures a portion of it, called the Fountain of Time, Washington Park, Chicago. And I didn't realize when I took these pictures, I do a cemetery show, actually a couple of them now, and I didn't realize when I took these pictures at Graceland that both of these were done by the same guy from Elmwood, Illinois. One of them's kind of creepy, called Eternal Silence, and the other, The Crusader. But the guy was named Laredo Taft, and he did get some training in Europe. He was born in Elmwood, raised there for the most part, and went out and accomplished things as an artist. The last work that he unveiled was dedicated just a week before his death. It was in Quincy, and that was one of the 7 debate sites for the Lincoln and Douglas debates back in 1858. So Laredo Taft got in on that too. But remarkable thing, again, from a small town, and went out and accomplished great things. Well, we'll get back to the main line of the show here. A few words to describe how towns were located where they are. And basically, it's the realtor's code: location, location, location. And rail lines that cross. That's a pretty good clue you're going to have a town there, and it's going to be a successful one. In this case, Mount Pulaski, which is still a small town, but a very nice town. Well, another way of phrasing this location, 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 one of those locations needs to include uh, good transportation resources. Now, the oldest, earliest towns in Illinois were all on rivers because that was the only way to travel in those days. And from the time of the Egyptians forward until we had railroads and power boats on barges on rivers, it was to move things on barges that were pushed or pulled along canals or rowed upstream, downstream. That's the only way you could get anywhere in those days. And so our earliest towns had river transportation. Well, the river transportation was superseded by the railroads, arriving in the 1840s and 1850s and fanning out all over the state. And that is the single most important part of the founding of a town, that because of the railroads. I'm sure somebody has counted up. There are 2,400 places on the state road map, and I would just casually estimate that at least 1,800, maybe 2,000, maybe more of those towns were on a railroad. That's why they're still on the map today and why they prospered. Yeah, we had trails early on, but you couldn't take wagons on them. We didn't have paved roads in Illinois until basically the 1920s under Governor Lynn Small. And of course, that was a great wonder to have paved roads over roads that were mud or gravel in mud. Um, you'd think the interstates and paved roads would have a big impact on the placement of founding of towns. Not really so. When we finally got the paved roads, they just connected the cities and towns that were already on the rivers and the railroads. And interstates, while they absolutely help a town, didn't have a big role in the founding of any towns that I could name. I've mentioned the phenomenon or phenomena when the interstate misses a town, how that town grows out towards the interstate. So that is impactful for such towns. But um, transportation, that's one of the key things for location. The other is natural resources. Illinois is mostly an agricultural state. Our number one resource is soil. That's some of the richest farmland in the world right here in Illinois. So that was something that could be exploited early on by the technology. And of course, Cyrus McCormick's Reaper helped. John Deere's steel plow helped. Tiling helped drain some of these lands that would have been wet otherwise. But the vast majority of our Illinois towns were started for agricultural purposes and agricultural communities, collection points for grain and all, and they still serve that purpose. Other natural resources, I mean, under the soil, coal. I think Pennsylvania is the only state that has more coal. But I understand their coal is better than ours. We have high sulfur coal. But still, coal mining was a huge industry. So that was one that could be built around natural resources. I showed the quarry down at Thornton, which has been said to be the world's largest. Um, and that may be true, but when I was in England, a guy pointed to a quarry and said, that's the world's largest. So again, who's keeping track of these things? But there are other natural resources out there that Illinois had to offer. For instance, there was more tonnage of fish, if that would be the right term, harvested out of the Mississippi in some years than the entire eastern seaboard along the Atlantic, which is kind of a mind-blowing statistic, but I understand that it's true. And there were some other things to mine, like lead in the Galena area, and that's why that was settled. Down in the south, there was fluorite, various other natural resources. But that was a good thing to have along with the transportation. And the third thing, people. People to work those mines, people to tend the stores, people to buy things in the small town stores. And well, this happens to be a picture at one of the John Deere plants early on of John Deere employees over in East Moline. But it was the same everywhere around the state, and it was a great time for immigrants to come to America and settle in these small towns. If you're an Italian cobbler, shoemaker, you may have had 50 people in your own village that you were competing with. You come to Illinois, you might be the only person within a 50-mile radius that can do that kind of work. So it was good business. Cheesemakers, same thing. Brewers from Germany or Britain, good business. So it took the people to settle all these places to make all these things work. Yeah, I can't see anything from the back there. Too bad. Well, so Illinois was settled basically for those reasons, and the 2,400 towns got started, and others that didn't make it along the way. The first settlers in Illinois came to the south because they came down the Ohio River, which is on the southeastern side of the state, and the federal land office was at Shawneetown. So that was usually the first stop. They got themselves some land, signed the papers, and there were some roads that led from there to other parts of the state. Even people who came through Kentucky by way of the Daniel Boone Wilderness Road, when they reached the Great Falls of the Ohio, where Louisville is today, they floated from there. So most people did come in by way of the Ohio River, and that led them to southern Illinois. In 1839, the first national road, the Cumberland Road from Cumberland, Maryland, the first real wagon road to Illinois, also led people basically to southern Illinois. It reached what was our state capital at that time, Vandalia, although seat of government had already been moved up the way to Springfield. But the Cumberland Road was a way for people to make it to Illinois. And I understand I had ancestry that came by wagon from Pennsylvania on the Cumberland Road. Um, Railroads could, when they developed, they could take people anywhere. When Chicago was first getting started, travel by means of the Great Lakes was the way to get there. Later, it was the railroads, and they could take people anywhere. But the settlement of Illinois has basically, well, our state capitals moved north as the population moved north. But the center of population moved from way down here in southern Illinois gradually up this direction. And I think the center of population, I'm not sure what town it is in now, but and the statistic changes, so I'm never really sure. But the southern tip of Lake Michigan is right there. I-80 basically runs in that manner across the state. And 75 or 80% or more of the state's population is now in this upper 40 miles, which was originally slated to be a part of Wisconsin. But Illinois stole it fair and square before Wisconsin was a state. And that's where the large majority of the Illinois population is, mainly because of Chicago and the suburbs. Of course, Rockford is up there too, a sizable city. But that's how the population has developed and moved over the course of time. All right, our second installment of the Everyone Comes From Somewhere. Are you familiar with Freeport at all? It's county seat of Stevenson County, nice town. It was settled mainly by Germans, and they made pretzels in addition to beer. So they're the home of the pretzels. There is one other high school team in the state that calls itself the Pretzels. It's Berlin, Illinois, only it's pronounced Berlin in Illinois, but they're also the home of the pretzels. Anyway, it's a nice town. I had good experiences there, and there was a famous person born in Freeport. You may have heard the name Luella Parsons. She was from a previous generation, but you may have read of her if you read of old Hollywood. She was a Hollywood gossip columnist, described as the first lady of Hollywood on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, famously feuded with the other gossip columnist, Hedda Hopper. And I put in red her biggest scoop because it sounds so distant and so far away. The divorce of Douglas Fairbanks Jr. from Mary Pickford. I guess I wouldn't know either of those if I saw a picture of them, but I've certainly heard and read the names, and that was a big deal at the time. And at my age now, it's almost impossible for like supermarket tabloids to run a scandal on so and so named Alicia and some guy named Bob. I don't know who Alicia and Bob are. They may be the biggest stars in Hollywood now. I can't stay up with them. And so I know more about the past people like Luella Parsons than I would about the current ones. Galesburg. I know you've heard of Galesburg, and there's one person that you absolutely need to have heard of if you haven't already. It's one of Illinois' great poets, one of the top three or four, Carl Sandburg. And I know my niece, who grew up in the Chicago area, when I asked her if she knew who Carl Sandburg was, she said, I think he played for the Cubs. Well, it's not that quite the same guy. Carl Sandburg was born and raised in this little house in Galesburg. He's buried today under Remembrance Rock in the backyard. But he was the real deal in his time. He was a newspaperman by trade. He described Chicago as a city of big shoulders, and he wrote of fog that comes into San Francisco, I think, on little cat feet. And that's one of the great descriptions of fog creeping in. He wrote an exhaustive 3-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln. He collected American folk tunes and stories throughout his life. He spoke at the dedication of the Assembly Hall in Champaign, now the State Farm Center, when it opened in 1963. That's kind of connecting some dots. because he was around in my time at any rate. Born in Galesburg, he lived his later years and died at Flat Rock, North Carolina. I could have told him, don't go to Flat Rock, North Carolina, but he did it anyway, and it done him in. Anyway, there's another person that you probably haven't heard of that was from Galesburg, but you'll remember it after this evening. His name is George Washington Gale Ferris, a civil engineer, and his grandfather, Galesburg was actually named for his grandfather, apparently the Gale part of his name. Anyway, he was an engineer, started an engineering firm at Pittsburgh to test metals for railroad bridges and so on. But in 1892 or so, with the Columbian Exposition in 1893 coming up, Daniel Burnham and others in Chicago were desperate to find some big attraction for that Chicago World's Fair. And they put out a call, an engineering challenge. They wanted something to surpass the Eiffel Tower at the previous World's Fair in Paris. That's kind of a big assignment to top the world or the Eiffel Tower. But his solution, he proposed a great moving wheel for which over 2,000 riders at a time could view the entire exhibition. The giant Ferris wheel was the hit of the Chicago World's Fair, and Ferris was the toast of the engineering world. Uh, uh, Again, small town guy, but does something remarkable. And he was the toast of the engineering world, but for only 3 years. I don't know if this is a drawing or a picture that's been enhanced, but he doesn't look well. And he died 3 years after the Columbian Exposition of typhoid fever. So the future didn't pan out for very long for George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. But he did it while he was there. Right, there's a little town south of Champaign, I guess would be the closest. Maybe Decatur is closer. It's in Edgar County. That's on the east edge of the state. Population 325. So there's not a whole lot of Hume. You're looking at the downtown right there. But there was a guy there who came along and did something. His name was Edward Doisy, a biochemist. Yeah, educated at the University of Illinois, Harvard, taught at various places, including the University of Chicago, and won the 1943 Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamin K. So again, some small town guy came up and did something. There's a little town in the Kankakee area called Irwin, and there's not much of it. According to the 2020 census figures, 68 people live there. I know there's still this bar. It's been called various things, featuring American cuisine. What would you expect at Irwin, Illinois? Anyway, there's a grain elevator in that bar and a few houses, and that's about it. But this guy that I hadn't heard of, and maybe some of you did hear of him along the way, he passed on in 1955, but listen to the things Arch Ward did. Sports editor for the Chicago Tribune, which would be something right there. He's the creator of the Major League Baseball All-Star Game, which is, of course, a big deal. He created the Golden Gloves Amateur Boxing Championships. My understanding is that my dad fought in that. Created the World Professional Basketball Tournament. I don't know what that is, but it would be the NBA Championships now. Remember the College All-Star Football Classic where college All-Stars would play a professional team? That was always a big draw. Now everybody's afraid of injury, so they don't have that game anymore, but he started that. He was offered the job of the NFL commissioner, but turned it down to start the rival AFC. He wrote 3 sports-related books. Not bad for a guy from Irwin, Illinois, with 68 people. There were probably more in his time, but he excelled among them. And there's a little town down on Lake Carlisle, which is the largest man-made lake in the state. I think it's the Kaskaskia River that they dammed. And actually, you see some of the levee that protects Keysport from an overflow of Lake Carlisle. But there was a guy from there, small town now, 406 people. His name was Wilbur Clark. He became a casino owner and land developer in the Las Vegas area. He built and owned the Desert Inn, founded the Desert Inn Golf Classic. That's Wilbur with his friends at the time, Ed Sullivan and Red Skelton. You'll remember the names. And he was given the nickname, get this, Mr. Las Vegas. Now, how does a guy come from Keysport, Illinois, and become Mr. Las Vegas? He must have had some kind of talent. All right. A quick study now of how Illinois towns developed, how pre-Prohibition Peoria became the whiskey capital of the world. Well, depending on what your natural resources were in the area, as well as your transportation resources and the people you could attract, most towns in Illinois were built on an agricultural basis and agricultural communities. And in this picture at Arensville, you see the three things that would have been unique to an agricultural community as opposed to, say, a coal mining community. You've got the mill, you've got a grain elevator, and somewhere, I guess there's the CB&Q depot. Well, other towns on rail lines would have had depots too. But grain elevators and mills were important to a farming community that attracted people. In coal mining communities, or maybe the other mining communities, sometimes a company would come in and basically build their own town. It would have a company, company houses, company store, various company services. They'd build the streets, and people worked hard and at much risk in those days. These working in coal mines under the earth was dangerous for fires, for explosions, for cave-ins, all that kind of stuff. And we don't see much of that today because it was all under the earth, and what was above it closed up and moved a long time ago. What you do sometimes see, especially in north central Illinois, um, when they'd burrow into the earth and bring out coal, they had to separate it from just the dirt. And they'd pile up the dirt in these great big mounds, and they were referred to as jumbos. Winona, Illinois had a jumbo, Toluca had a jumbo, Standard, Illinois had a jumbo. Cherry, where the mine disaster was, still has a big jumbo, partly in memorial to the miners who died there. But this is one at now a ghost town where nobody lives, Cardiff in Livingston County. But again, you've got people working there, you got stores, you probably got a siding for the railroad. It brings people and business to that community. Then there are the other types of communities that had good transportation, but not necessarily their own natural resources. They'd take natural resources from elsewhere and combine it, massage it, and develop products from there, which is what most towns in Illinois do today. The Union Malleable Iron Company in East Moline was actually built by the John Deere Company as a part of his steel plow manufacturing plant, which eventually made East Moline the farm implement capital of the world. But whether we're working in an insurance office today or whatever it is, we come in the category of using resources from elsewhere and finding a way to make a living on that. And if people are coming to these places for other reasons, it's a good place for somebody to put in a store. So down in Albers, Illinois, they put in Tawny's General Store, which is still in business to this day. And they've expanded quite a bit, and they sell quite a few things, hardware and everything else. But Tawny's is still in business down in Clinton County. Other businesses would be attracted. Shoe salesmen and clothing salesmen, and all these different stores would come in to serve the people that worked in the mines, to serve that agricultural community. They'd open restaurants. There'd be maybe a railroad hotel to operate. All these things attracted people, and business and towns grew. This is a picture of Market Day in Blue Island on Broadway Street back in the day. And I don't know about market days in Illinois. I know in England, there were market towns where I think one day a week, maybe it was once a month, I don't know, would be market day, and everybody would come to town and they had something to sell or to buy. They were there, and that was going on in Blue Island at the time. McKanda, Illinois, the same deal. That's down in the Shawnee Hills. It's down by, well, it's the next railroad stop up from Cobden, Illinois. Cobden was known as South Pass originally. McKanda was North Pass. And later, Senator Paul Simon would live at McKanda. It's kind of the gateway to Giant City State Park. Well, look at how people gather when the railroad comes in. It was a railroad town initially, and it looked like a pretty rough frontier town there for a while, but it got to be a little bit more polished over time, and then time kind of forgot it. There's not a whole lot there now, but what's there is worth seeing. Well, eventually, the do-gooders would come to town. There are a lot of souls to be saved in these rough towns, so churches showed up, all denominations and all faiths eventually. And well, that was undoubtedly a good thing because, along with churches, they wanted to start educating the youngins. So schools came along, libraries were started, civic organizations where people could volunteer for various things uh, developed. It was a good influence on all Illinois communities, especially the female influence being in these rough mining towns and so on. They weren't going to go anywhere as mining towns or future towns at all. But when you had the feminine influence, that brought all the civilized things. Not that we still didn't need a lawman once in a while. Louis Wheeler was the village marshal at Glen Carbon, which was another coal mining town. And I mentioned what was it, the Zebold building or whatever down in Redbud. Well, in 1894, they built a nice city hall there. It was a German town again, and they built a city hall of the kind that they would have known back in Europe. And it's still a very impressive city hall to this day. And basically, in that manner, our old towns like Joliet and Peoria grew into big towns, modernized along the way, and grew a lot. And and yet, for some reason, for no known reason, out of the blue, somehow women found complaints, and they had to be heard. And well, that's about the time that men discovered bars and alcohol and spent a lot of time there. When they weren't mining, they were drinking. And well, that's how Peoria became the whiskey capital of the world. Pre-Prohibition days, Hiram Walker was the biggest distillery in the world. And it was before there was an income tax. And there's a remarkable statistic that most of the taxes collected by the federal government pre income tax was excise taxes on things like alcohol. And over half of all taxes paid in America at that time, when Peoria was the whiskey capital of the world, were paid out of Peoria, and the taxes on the whiskey out of Peoria. That's really hard to believe, but it's been verified multiple times at the museum in Peoria. I take their word for it. Pretty impressive. So that's how towns developed. All right, our third installment of Everyone Comes from Somewhere. Macomb. You've heard of Macomb, home of Western Illinois University. Well, population of 15,000 at this point, and you'd expect some people to come from a town of that size. But it was clear back in 1866 where a gal named Lizzie, and I'm going to simplify her last name because I don't know how to pronounce it. I'll just say McGee. Lizzie McGee was born. And she lived to 1948. Along the way, she was a writer. She was a feminist. She was probably the one that was one of them complaining. And she was a board game designer. She designed a board game to teach people the sins of capitalism. Didn't work out the way she thought, but it became enormously successful. She called it the landlord's game. And we, being Americans, we identified with the landlords at least as much or more than the renters. So the rest of us knew that game that she designed as Monopoly, one of the most popular board games in the world, but certainly here in America. And that was Lizzie McGee's doing. And I'm sure she made a lot of capitalist dollars out of that herself. But nobody really knows her name. Well, now you do. Myrna is near Bloomington. In fact, it's more or less been, it's kind of on the farming outskirts of Bloomington in McLean County, which is the largest county land-wise in the state. Myrna is unincorporated. So when you drive through a town like that, this was from like 35 years ago, and it doesn't show a population because there are just a few. It usually means there's less than 100 people or so. They don't even put it on the sign. Well, even if you drive through Myrna now, they still don't show a population. You'll see the old grain elevator rusting in the background, and there is this one business in town. It's a tavern restaurant. I've never been in it, but I'm told it's a going place, that people enjoy it. So I need to stop in there sometime. But the reason Myrna makes the program is because there was a farmer who lived at Myrna. Oh, today there are 4 or 5 houses in Myrna. So however many people live in 4 or 5 houses. And he must have lived in one of those houses at the time. I don't know how to pronounce his name either. George Mesherly. Your guess is as good as mine. But he was kind of outraged at what he was paying for insurance on his farm. And he got to thinking, there are high crime areas that, there's a legitimate chance their house is going to be burgled. There's the barn would be, or garage would be vandalized. And he's sitting out there in the country where there's no crime whatsoever. And he had the suspicion that insurance payers like himself were subsidizing the high risk areas. And he didn't like the idea of that. So he did a little investigation, did quite a bit of study on the insurance industry, enough to learn the ins and outs. And he actually started his own insurance company. And you know it today as State Farm. It is one of the 20th largest corporations in the Fortune 500. And it started with George Mesherly. Again, don't even know how to pronounce the name, but I'm thinking he probably got a better deal on his insurance by founding his own company. And State Farm has done quite well for itself. Well, this is a silly one. Bureau County is up near where the Big Bend in the Illinois River is. It's Princeton, Illinois is the county seat of Bureau County, if that helps you at all. Mineral was named for the coal deposits in the area, and it's a small town, 206, probably more at one time. I have a friend who lives in the Peoria area now, but he grew up at Mineral, and he would be offended if I did not include this name in the program as small towners who make it big. You're looking down the main street of Mineral, it's still quite small. And my friend could tell me about hiding on Halloween up above these buildings and throwing firecrackers out to watch the town cop respond. And he wouldn't know where they were, and they'd run to the other end of the building and throw firecrackers back there. Have that guy on the run. Small town stuff. But a guy named Hiram Boardman Conabear, a strange name, never heard it before, was born and raised in Mineral, pioneering collegiate coach and physical conditioning expert. As the rowing coach at the University of Washington, he developed the Conabear stroke that influenced the sport for 30 years and led the University of Washington rowing crew to an Olympic gold medal, as seen in the 2023 movie, The Boys in the Boat. I didn't see the movie, but I remember it going around. I told my friend we need to go see that, and he'd forgotten by that time why we should go see it, so we didn't. But get this, look how he died, this physical conditioning expert. He died in Seattle, Washington, falling from a plum tree in his backyard at the age of 46. So, well, I guess these things happen if you climb around in your plum trees enough. Do you know we have a Paris in Illinois? Yes, we do. And it was named for that place in France. You've probably heard of that one as well. It's the largest city in Edgar County. Um, and well, let me show you the courthouse there in Paris. It is a beauty by my reckoning, the old-fashioned grand style. I asked somebody at one of my programs years ago if he could describe what type of architecture this was, and he described it as American grotesque. Well, gosh, I kind of like that. At least they were trying to stand out and be something special. Some of these courthouses, like this one, are magnificent in my book. Well, the famous person from Paris that you've all seen, I may not know his name, but we're very familiar with him at this point. Carl Switzer, known as Alfalfa, played in the Our Gang series. He and his brother grew up at Paris. His brother Harold was apparently a member of the cast, and I don't remember him or what he looked like, but I certainly remember Alfalfa. Died in 1959 of a gunshot wound in Mission Hills, Kansas. Along the way, he was an actor, musician, singer, dog breeder, hunting guide. And in the trivia department, in It's a Wonderful Life, he played Donna Reed's high school date and played a slave in the Ten Commandments. Who knew? I didn't recognize him in the Ten Commandments or It's a Wonderful Life, but recognize him from Our Gang and will continue to for a long time. All right, we'll move back to the main line of the program again. How does a town wind up as an official town? Well, it turns out that there are several steps to it. And the first is getting surveyed. And if you're a town that's been surveyed by Abe Lincoln, you're going to put that as a marker at the edge of town so that everybody knows that. That's pretty much the only claim to fame that Bath, Illinois enjoys. Although there's a little, I don't know what you'd call it, a joke, I guess. There's the town called Pekin. Um, the phrase was that when the girls went to Bath, the boys went to Pekin. Now you know. All right. Um, well, surveying was necessary for a town to be platted. If you wanted to start a town, you had to have it surveyed, and you lay out a map for the town where the streets are going to be, maybe where City Hall is going to be, where the houses will be, where the businesses will be. And of course, you don't really know all that. It's sort of speculation, but you can't really advertise that you're going to have a town until you've had it surveyed and platted. And platted just means a flat map on file at the state or the county or wherever that you want to start this town. Then you start advertising for settlers. So historic Prairie du Rocher, a French town in what was known as the American Bottom down by Kaskaskia, settled in 1722. Georgetown, East Central Illinois, founded in 1827. Coletta, North Central Illinois, established in 1840. Well, I found on these welcoming signs to Illinois towns, there's no rhyme or reason to what they choose. And some will say platted, founded, settled. What did Bloomingdale say? It was founded in 1833, or was it settled in 1833? Anyway, when what was the Meacham Road that started Bloomingdale. It was either settled or founded. I don't know. But there's no rhyme or reason on what a town chooses to say. It doesn't correspond with incorporation necessarily. It's just they use a different phrase and a different date. Um, Eventually, they did want to be incorporated. And when I first started giving these programs 35 years ago, I had the booklet of the incorporated communities in the state, and there were only something like two towns that were most declared either incorporated as a village or as a city, or the other choice was to just remain unincorporated if you're out in a country area. But now there are a lot of places listed as towns on the map. Now, I've usually, because I knew that towns, communities had incorporated as villages or cities, towns were usually reserved for townships. So I don't know how that works. I need to check. But there are more towns registered as towns now than there were 35 years ago, is what I'm trying to say. And this is one of them down in Pike County. And it's the sign that's crooked. It's not the town. The town is flat. And I'm sober as I took the picture. So blame the sign in Pike County. But it's the only official town in Pike County today, for whatever that means. Hoyleton in southern Illinois is the one that lays it all out in the right order that it should be. First, well, it would have been surveyed first, but it was platted as a town in 1858 by J.A. Bent and O. Minor. So those would have been the founders of the town. It was settled by Easterners and named after a pioneer named Henry Hoyle, of their acquaintance, I gather. This tablet dedicated August 2nd, 1941, the 60th anniversary of Hoyleton as an incorporated village. So we can go back to 1881 for the incorporation as a village and celebrate its centennial August 1st and 2nd of 1958. So how that varies from, well, why that date came about, I don't know. But that's when they celebrated their centennial. And anyway, that's the order and the things that are supposed to take place to be officially a city, a village, an unincorporated community, or now a town. And the process goes on. There are not new areas of Illinois being settled, but there are new areas where people will incorporate it as a community. And one of those, well, they always catch me by surprise. I'm not on the inside of anything, but driving towards Kankakee one day, I looked up and saw this enormous water tower that says the Village of Limestone. And I didn't know anything about it. Well, it was incorporated in 2006. A number of small communities in that area kind of combined, places that were otherwise unincorporated. And they may have been wanting to protect themselves from Kankakee. That's why a lot of places will incorporate, because there's some larger town nearby that they don't want to be a part of. So they protect themselves by incorporating and having their own city government or village government and going on. Campton Hills may have come about in some similar manner. You're familiar with that. That's to the west, maybe a little south of you, far western suburbs, you could say, like between Geneva and Elburn, that area is Campton Hills. And real pretty farmland, wooded, some creeks in the area, kind of rolling country. And for some reason, they incorporated in 2007 as Campton Hills instead of just being these little outlying places. And yeah, good for them. Here's one that this is just last year. I noticed it. I was driving in the area and I saw signs for Cahokia Heights. I knew Cahokia, and I knew of Fairview Heights and places like that in the East St. Louis, well, the St. Louis Metro East area on the Illinois side. Well, it turns out that three towns that were smaller and didn't have much political power decided to bind together, Cahokia, Allerton, and Centerville, to become Cahokia Heights. And so presumably they have a little more political power now and they can beat up on the littler towns than them now, whatever. I should also say that getting a post office was a whole different process to establishing a city, a village, or a town. That was more a matter of how much traffic, how many people live there, and going through the postal service to get authorized to have a post office. And sometimes new little towns that didn't make it would have a post office for 5 years or 10 years, and they just didn't see the volume. And so they'd yank the post office, and that was usually doomed for that town, but others would make it work. And because there were different processes, you ended up with different names for the same place. The railroad might give that stop a certain name. The settlers call it something else. And then when they try to get a post office, some other town has that name. So they have to have a third name. that will clear the post office and get on the map. And there's still places on the state map today where you'll see one name, well, Tovey is one, and then it shows in parentheses Humphrey, which is the alternative name. And I asked the postmistress there one day what that was about. She didn't even know about it. And I showed her the map. Yeah, it goes by this other name. So you see that occasionally, and they would sometimes make accommodations to get all three the same. All right, so you've got this town, and you've got the plat map where the streets are going to be. So you need a street pattern. And every Illinois town has some kind of a pattern, even if it's no pattern at all. No pattern is a pattern. But a good pattern for your streets is it has some predictive value. For instance, even if you've never been to that town before, you know that the next street over from 3rd Street is 4th Street. So that's a valuable thing. And most Illinois cities and villages that are successful have outgrown their original patterns. And out at the outskirts, they have random names and just invent names for, a subdivision or that kind of thing. But everybody starts with a pattern. And the least popular pattern in Illinois and around the country is the Washington, D.C. system. It's numbered streets opposite lettered streets. So first, second, numbered streets versus A, B, C, D. You'll hear of K Street in Washington, D.C. Well, you're limited from the beginning. You can only have 26 of those lettered streets. It's sort of like when you name presidents as the cross streets. You've got a limited number of presidents and duplications of Adams and Harrisons and Bushes and Grover Cleveland, 2 different terms and so forth. Trump, same thing. That complicates presidents. But anyway, the Washington, D.C. system was designed for Washington, D.C. It was good enough for government work. It wasn't very practical for other people. Even at Alpha, Illinois, they do use the Washington, D.C. system at Alpha, where everything is, as you might suppose, alphabetic, but it's not a popular system. More popular, because it'd been around forever, was the Boston system. They didn't have a particular pattern. It grew up like an old world town, wiggly waggly streets, and they'd name them as they started them. And Boston used certain names like Congress Street, Federal Street, Summer Street, Winter Street, Spring Street, Race Street, Arch Street. There were several that Boston used. And when other towns came along, they looked at Boston as a model and they said, hey, these are legitimate names for streets. We'll use them too, as Rushville is with Congress Street in that picture. The New York City system was much more specific and had a lot more predictive value. It's numbered avenues opposite numbered streets, which makes all kinds of sense unless you're trying to find an address and you inevitably find yourself on 6th Street when you should be on 6th Avenue. And you find the New York system mainly in West Central Illinois that was part of the military tract where veterans from the War of 1812 were given land in Illinois, and some of them settled, some of them just sold it for cash. But the New York system was brought to West Central Illinois, and a lot of towns used it. And the Quad Cities nobody's more sold on the New York system than the Quad Cities. And if you've been there and looked for an address, you know that because of the bends in the river, because of irregular bluffs, because of so many towns jammed together using the New York system, it's almost impossible to find anything in the Quad Cities. Lewis and Clark didn't even try to fight their way through the Quad Cities on their way to the Pacific. Couldn't be done. The most popular system in the United States and Illinois was the Philadelphia system, designed by Quaker William Penn, the founder of the Pennsylvania colony and the city of brotherly love. And he did a very simple thing. He started at the river. I'm thinking that was the Schuylkill, but I don't know. And the first street along it was First Street. The next street up, parallel, Second, Third Street, Fourth Street, and so on. The crossing streets which we now sometimes give to presidents or settlers' names or neighboring town names for our system of cross streets. Um, the Quakers liked green growing things from the earth. So generally it was trees names or at least vines, something like that, that grows. Later here in Illinois, we weren't shy about using people's names, but that's the Philadelphia system. And it does have predictive value, at least going one direction. And if you memorized what the streets were, it actually, there was a little rhyme. And I've never found an Illinois town to have all these names, but I found two of them that have 7 of the 8 in this rhyme. So in Philadelphia, there was Market Street, Arch Street, Race Street, Vine, Chestnut, Walnut, Spruce Street, Pine. So if you knew the rhyme, you knew which the streets were coming up, which seems a little bit difficult, but that was part of the idea. I understand some of these names have since changed, but that was the initial rhyme. We still had room for names of, well, practical names. The street that went to the mill was Mill Street, Depot Street, Commerce Street, those kind of names. The street that ran along the railroad could be Front Street, but it was also used the Front Street. You fronted on the railroad the same way you'd front on a river. And it's usually used in those terms on a river or a lake or along the railroad. But New Minden, Illinois didn't have a railroad or a lake or a river. They still have a Front Street because they knew it was a good name for a street, so they used it. You got the situation where you've got on your plat, you've named the streets. You got Main Street, you got Church Street, School Street, others like that. So how do you convince the churches to settle on Church Street? If they could get a better deal elsewhere, they undoubtedly put their church elsewhere. So maybe after the fact, you come in and change the name to Church Street where the churches actually are. I don't know how that works, but I know that at Ottawa, they got it worked out. Whatever came first, I don't know. But by all the steeples, you can tell this is Church Street at Ottawa. We like to have honorific names for local heroes, local people who've gone out and done something. I don't know if you'll recognize this guy's name or his face, but in Abington, Illinois, he was a national hero. Admiral James Stockdale, he was the highest ranking American officer to serve as a prisoner of war at the Hanoi Hilton. He spent 7 years of his life there. In 1992, he ran for vice president under Ross Perot, and that didn't work out. But look at the man. He looks like the real deal. And they honor him in Abington, Illinois, if nowhere else. Jacksonville, Illinois, home of Illinois College, home of Ken Norton. So you see Ken Norton Way. You may not remember the name, or you might. He was a heavyweight champion of the world at one time, and he was an exceptional all-round athlete. In fact, because of Ken Norton, the Illinois High School Association passed what they call the Ken Norton rule, that a schoolboy athlete could not enter more than 5 events in the state track meet to keep one person from dominating everything. And that's what Ken Norton would have done, is dominated every event. He was one of these guys that grew up more quickly, was stronger, faster, quicker, just better physically than everybody else. And he was a pretty good guy, as I understand it. But yeah, Jacksonville's finest right there. Champaign honors singer Alison Krauss. Great singer. There's Alison Krauss Way, and she spent a lot of time in Champaign through the years. Well, it's also Champaign where you'll find the happy coincidence of my name at the corners of John and Lynn streets. Good story about that. We haven't got time for it today. Other streets come together very harmoniously in the prairie state of Illinois. This is at Hebron. Back at Bradford, they've got Gold Street and Silver Street. You'd think that would be a little nicer neighborhood, but why they got the names, I don't know. Palatine is home to Easy and Comfort Streets. That's got to be a great place to live. And if you see this kind of a combination, this is at Metamora, Illinois, understand that's not a coincidence. That's by plan that Mount Vernon and Washington Streets come together. At Waukegan, it's a grand frolic wherever they go. At Campus, Illinois, they're expecting some kind of tragedy of biblical proportions, Locust Street and Flood Street. Union and Division. I'm checking the time here. We are just about at our time. So I'm going to get through some of these here a little. Well, there's one that's worth enjoying. Some towns try harder than others here. Um, given our traditions of street names and street patterns, what's the most common street name across America today? Well, it's think about it a moment. It's not First Street because often First Street was used as Main Street. And it's not Main Street because Main Street goes by different names, different places. It's Broadway here, it's Commercial Street there, it's a variety of names. So what does that suggest to you would be the most common name, street name across America and probably Illinois too? It would be Second Street. Makes sense, right? Okay, we'll keep moving, but we're still within our time confines, so I won't skip much here. Yeah, we have Main Street in Illinois. In Britain, it's called High Street, but not for its elevation, for its prominence. In Illinois, High Street is almost always a reference to elevation, although there's one exception that I can think of, and that's a place called Linville in Morgan County down by Jacksonville. It was settled by the English. They dragged that name all the way over and found a place where they could use it, Main and High Streets. That's got to be the most important point in Linville, Illinois. When you see Short Street, that's almost always a literally short street of a block or two. When you see Narrow Street, it's almost invariably a narrow. But if you see Long Street, that's more often a family name than indicating the length of that street, just so you know. All right, a few words about community parks. All right, the desire for green spaces, for sunshine and fresh air, for exercise or play is more or less universal. The idea of public parklands devoted to these purposes descends to us from the common lands of England and others of the old countries. So back in, say, Britain, which is what I'm most familiar with, they didn't, each farmer didn't have his own land out there to graze his animals. There were common lands where they could all graze their lands, which is why they had to be able to mark their animals in some way. When it came time to market, they could separate their animals or tell them apart from the other farmers. But the common lands, anybody could roam. The farm animals could roam. And unfortunately, what they found is if you have farm animals roaming up and down the streets of your villages, that's not a very sanitary situation. So they passed the enclosure laws, and the animals were removed from the common lands, and they did have to have their own pasturage. Maybe a couple of farmers could share, but they had to have their private pasturage out there to keep the animals from roaming around. Well, we kept it for the common lands for people. And so that's where you'll find walking trails outside English towns and all. And the idea of common lands for people continued in the form of village greens, town squares, and other public green spaces we now think of as our parks in Illinois. So, a few words about town square parks. And this is going to, well, little bit involved, but it's kind of interesting. In England, a furlong is a distance. It happens to be the length of a furrow. How they figured a guy with a horse and a plow, that's as far as he could go out before he'd have to come back. I don't know how they determined that, but a furlong is an eighth of a mile. So you need 8 furlongs to the mile. In the US, we still use furlongs in many, if not most of our cities. the furlong is a standard distance for a long city block. Most of the long city blocks run north to south. And well, there are short blocks, and those usually run east and west. But for those north-south streets, every 8 blocks, for those 190 plus blocks from the south suburbs to downtown Chicago, that is a measured mile. So they're using the long blocks in that instance. And the idea of a square block as a village green or a town square again goes back to the old countries. In England, um, it just happens to be the amount of space you'd need for a cricket field or a cricket pitch or whatever they call it over there. In America, it was just the perfect size for a baseball field. And that's one of the reasons Ken Burns gave in his documentary on baseball that baseball really took off in American towns because when guys came home from the Civil War having learned this sport, they found there was a place right there in the middle of town where they could play this sport and challenge other towns and so on. Kickapoo is a town near Peoria where they've had well, I think they celebrated 120 years as the Kickapoo Ball Diamond and still used for that on summer evenings and other times too. It was also good for roundabouts. We put in roundabouts everywhere to, like the English, to avoid all the stoplights. You move, you yield right away unless there's something coming, in which case you can go. So that helps. And we used them for courthouse squares. At Plymouth, Illinois, which is a small dying town of probably well less than 400 now, they have a town square park right in the middle of town. And it used to be businesses gathered around the square. Now there's maybe one or two businesses that still operate. But notice it's a one-way street. It's a roundabout to cut down on the rush hour traffic in Plymouth, Illinois. Anyway, it's a nice little town. I don't mean to speak against it, but it hasn't seen good times in a long time. Well, a lot of towns use that town square as a town park. Smithshire, I mentioned earlier in the program, Woodson down by Jacksonville, Ipava over towards Macomb. Town square parks can be very nice. It's also great for the courthouse square. Um, Livingston County has a beautiful courthouse at Pontiac. I mean, that's really impressive. Again, it's an old style, maybe not as gaudy as the Edgar County courthouse, but it's an impressive courthouse. Simple one at Golconda in Pope County, but it's a courthouse square. And at Benton, well, it's basically a roundabout and the courthouse. Um, I don't know where people park. Well, I guess they've got some parking around the edges there. Um, but these courthouses and the courthouse squares, one of the hardest things to photograph because a lot of times they have trees around the courthouse building, and you can back off the width of the street around the courthouse square, and then you're back up against all the stores and so forth. So you can't get far enough away, and sometimes you're blocked by trees. And yeah, courthouses, you could write a book on difficulties. You need an architectural lens, which kind of, instead of having the skewed, you can straighten up the pictures. All right, the fourth installment of Everyone Comes From Somewhere. How many have been to Quincy? I recommend it. It's an impressive town. Again, it was settled by Germans. There must have been money. There are a lot of really nice houses in Quincy. And you're also struck as you drive to Quincy by the fact that it's not on the way to any place. You've got to want to go to Quincy, county seat of Adams County, known as the Gem City, and a big population. I like small towns. Quincy's bigger than a small town, but it has some interesting people who've come from there. I mentioned there must have been money because you see these fine old homes in Quincy on the bluff overlooking the Mississippi and all. There's the John Wood House there. He was the founder of the town, later became a governor of Illinois, and you've probably noticed Illinois governors do well for themselves somewhere along the way. And John Wood certainly did. He's got, or did, he has a great mansion there. Um, a woman lived in this house. Her name was Lucille Vasconcelos Langehenke, or however it was pronounced. I have no idea. The last name was German. Her mother was of Portuguese descent. That's where the Vasconcelos came from. Anyway, she and her parents lived in this house. They rented it. I don't think they had the whole house. It's now several different apartments, and they may have occupied a fourth of that house. I spent an afternoon one day, a year or so ago, looking up the various addresses where this woman lived with her parents. She was an only child, and her parents weren't all that successful in their own work, and they kind of lived through her and pushed her, and she carried him quite a ways, as it turned out. Um, Her mother sent a picture of her when she was, a teenage girl or whatever, to a photo contest in New York, and she was named the prettiest girl and whatever they were judging. And right immediately, her parents packed up. They moved her and themselves to New York City to start a career in show business based on Lucille's beauty. Well, they were also cruel to her. They never let her have friends. They didn't let her date. And even when she made it to Hollywood and was making big bucks, they cashed the checks. They gave her an allowance. And at some point, she finally broke free of that. But we know her, you know her, as Mary Astor. That was her Hollywood name. Somehow Lucille Vasconcelos Langehinke wasn't going to make it in Hollywood. You have seen her undoubtedly. She was in a lot of movies, but playing opposite Humphrey Bogart in The Maltese Falcon was one of the most recognizable roles. She was in Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte, and a whole bunch of other movies. Well, she had this to say about her career, looking back on it later. Five stages in the life of an actor. And I find that interesting. Actor. When I was growing up, there were actresses and there were actors. Men were actors, women were actresses. I don't see anything wrong with that, but apparently we started, now everybody's an actor. And I guess Mary Astor considered herself an actor from the beginning. But the five stages of her career, and as she inferred for everyone, first, producers and directors ask, who's Mary Astor? Who is this person? When they find out, get me Mary Astor for this part. Later, it was get me a Mary Astor type. Later yet, it was get me a young Mary Astor. And finally, back where she started, who's Mary Astor? I always enjoy that. City of Rushville, seat of Schuyler County, also where my father grew up. And this is the gazebo in the middle of the town park or bandstand. And I have some fond memories of, as a little kid, visiting my Lynn grandparents, say a week or two. And, I remember going out to this park on a Saturday evening, lights were strung. Everybody in town was out there for a stroll to see other people, and lemonade vendors and popcorn vendors. And what a I just cherish that memory of the town park there. Schuyler County Courthouse, I was out taking a picture of one day, and the judge saw me and waved me in, asked me if I wanted to tour the courthouse. Apparently, he didn't have much to do that day. And Judge Carson Klitz was his name, and he explained that the building plans were exactly identical to the courthouse at Monroe, Michigan. And the only reason that's interesting to me is because George Armstrong Custer was from Monroe, Michigan. Anyway, the courthouse at Schuyler County, exactly like the one at Monroe, Michigan. Brushville got in on the Opera House craze. That one looks like, I don't know, I can't read it from where I'm sitting here, 1882 or something like that, maybe, whatever. And there's a park at the edge of town called Scripps Park, donated by the grandchildren of the homesteader William A. Scripps. Well, that name may or may not be familiar to you, but it will be after tonight. Um, the Scripps family. Uh, E.W. Scripps, born in 1854 at Rushville, probably the son of that homesteader. He was the founder of the E.W. Scripps Company, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, United Press International, Society for Science and the Public, and the sponsor of the Scripps, formerly Scripps Howard National Spelling Bee, still held every year. He was said to have consumed a gallon of whiskey a day, pretty much rivaled Churchill and some of the other big drinkers through the years, and was rarely seen without a lit cigar. So when he died on his yacht at Monrovia, Liberia, it probably wasn't a surprise to anyone, but he got a lot accomplished along the way. Pretty impressive. Again, small town guy. Familiar with Streeter? That's in LaSalle County. You're looking down Main Street in LaSalle. It used to be the glass container capital of the world. Uh, was it name the big glass companies? Corning, some of those. Um, there used to be a unique silica sand from Ottawa, and they'd haul that down to Streeter to the glass companies, and it was the glass container capital of the world for many years. Well, you'd expect some people from the size of a town like Streeter to accomplish something, and yeah, one did. His name was Clyde William Tombaugh. As you can see on the historical marker, Clyde Tombaugh grew up in the area, went to high school in the area, became interested in astronomy at an early age. In 1922, his family moved to Kansas. He built telescopes, and at the age of 23, began work at the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. In 1930, after a lengthy study of reckoning by Percival Lowell, Tombaugh discovered the ninth planet in our solar system, which he named Pluto. Well, as you're probably aware, Pluto was kind of, I don't, decertified as a planet, but there are other people who say it should still be. And Trump is one of them that's saying it should still be our ninth planet till we find something that supplants it somehow. Anyway, yeah, Clyde Tombaugh. There's still Tombaughs in the Streeter area, and I went to college with one of them at Illinois. And he played freshman basketball at Illinois, and I hadn't seen him since those days. And I stopped by his farm one day. I actually talked his leg off. He had other things to do, but I was there, so I wanted to talk to him and ask him what's it like to be related to the guy who invented or discovered a planet. And he said, well, it was kind of neat to be a fourth grader and be the only kid in class who had a relative who discovered a planet. Well, yeah, I guess that would be a pretty neat experience. And that the Tombaugh is still in Streeter when Pluto got decertified or whatever, had a protest. They were carrying placards downtown, save our Pluto. Well, maybe someday they will get to save Pluto for us. Well, there are a few towns that stand out by just being different for one reason or another. And we still got a few minutes, so I'll kind of hit the high spots of one of these. It is a destination. You should want to go to Bishop Hill, Illinois, in Henry County. Um, it's was a Swedish colony, one of the first, I think, one or two colonies of Swedes in America. And it was going to be a utopian community founded by this guy named Eric Jansen, who, well, he founded Bishop Hill in 1846, and they practiced a collectivist system, had mixed results. It finally dissolved. I read a book once on utopian societies in America, and they all start off um, with what was it? Three things in common. They were all utopian, they were all collectivist, and they all hated lawyers. And they all eventually broke apart because they would find that some people worked a lot harder than the others, and the ones who worked harder resented it, and the loafers enjoyed it, and they'd break apart on those lines. Well, that's how it happened to Bishop Hill. although it happens that Jansen was murdered by one of his followers in 1850. Anyway, um, if you have a chance to visit the place, it's very interesting. Some of the old buildings are there, very quiet little community and scenic, and these old buildings and some museums, uh, monument to the settlers there, the colony church, uh, various things. Beautiful downtown park and a ball diamond right next to it. Um, just a nice spot. It is a destination. That is a place for you to go. Still, in Ford County, it's no special thing at all. Don't even think about it, but I mention it because it was different. Again, it was a communal society founded by the Stell Group from Chicago. Today, there's an estimated population of about 100, or as of 2013. It was, again, a collectivist thing, and it was started as a private neighborhood. But in 1982, they kind of went into it, became a traditional homeowners association. They opened up property to the public. It still maintains its own telephone company, a garden co-op, a tool co-op, which would be handy. And you may have noticed they have kind of a nice swimming pool along with a communal dinner once a week. So they maintain some of the traditions that they started it with, but it's nothing to go and see. Take my word for that. Riverside, you're probably familiar with that, the first planned suburb in the United States. And it's a lovely community, and it was planned and developed. Uh, the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted planned that community. He's the one who established Central Park in New York, the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and it is a lovely leafy village with elegant streets and elegant houses. And if you haven't been through there, you might as well take a look. And yeah, there are homes by Frank Lloyd Wright and all the other big architects along the way. Nauvoo, that's also a tourist destination. It's in Hancock County. If you took in Quincy, you could take in Nauvoo at the same time. Of course, that was the Mormon settlement. And for a few years before the Mormon Exodus starting 1846, Nauvoo was by far the largest city in the state, much larger than Chicago was in that day. Well, it's down to about 1,000 people today. But as you could expect of the Mormons, they take really good care of the Mormon area, which is kind of in the flats along the Mississippi River. The town is up on the bluff. Their area was down along the river, and it's good for a tour. It's something you should want to see, and you will also see while there the grave of uh, Joseph Smith, the founder of the religion, the prophet, his brother Hiram. They were both killed at the Carthage jail one night by a mob, and the grave of Emma Hale Smith, wife of Joseph Smith. So these are historic things, and they built a new temple. There was a wonderful temple up on the bluff. Well, it got burned by the mobs, and in 2002, they reestablished a Mormon temple there. And you have to be a Mormon to go in and see it. They had it open for a few weeks in 2002 so Gentiles could see it too. I didn't get there for that, but I got to it afterwards. It's a pretty impressive structure from the outside. And if you're at all interested in winding down the Great River Road, Nauvoo is something you'd want to take in. Another interesting town that was different, another utopian experiment. This was an English one. The town is called Albion, which of course another name. I think whether that's a Latin name for England or just a separate name. Anyway, that's what it means. County seat of Edwards County. A couple thousand people live there. Chowder capital of the world. Um, that's a big festival. They have these big metal pots. They cook soup, and it's not clam chowder, but they throw in vegetables and meats and stir it all up, and they have a festival. Several towns do, and Utica up in the north has a similar chowder festival. They call it something else, gumbo festival or something like that. Anyway, Albion, progressively independent since 1818. Beautiful Edwards County Courthouse, the courthouse square there. Um, the state's first public library opened in Albion in 1819. That was a year after Illinois became a state. They already had a free public lending library at this progressive English community. It was founded as English Prairie by English Quaker Morris Birkbeck and his business partner George Flower. They purchased 27,000 acres of land in Edwards County, which sounds like a pretty big, impressive project, but it fell apart because of conflict between the two founders. The conflict was George Flower had a couple of wives, and that didn't sit well with the rest of them. So it broke apart. But for his trouble, Morris Birkbeck had an unincorporated community in DeWitt County named for him. Hey, it's better than nothing. All right, everyone comes from somewhere. More people come from these three places than seem to come from all the other places combined. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll mention Belleville, Illinois. A bunch came from there. Centralia is very impressive, but I will mention Danville because it's kind of a favorite and it's a struggling town. They could use a little bit of a boost, and a lot of famous people have come from there. One, you can see astronaut Joseph Tanner was from there. Danville's claim to fame on the Potawatomi Trail of Death. That's not going to take you very far, is it? Well, Joe Cannon, former Speaker of the House, the Cannon office building in Washington, D.C. is named for them. He was featured on the first cover of Time magazine in 1923. Dick Van Dyke and Jerry Van Dyke, the actors, were from Danville. Donald O'Connor, the actor. Gene Hackman passed away a few months ago, who was a great actor, raised partly in Danville. Bobby Short, the jazz musician. Robin Yount, Major League Baseball Hall of Famer. Hobos used to get together, have a convention, and elect a hobo king. One of them is buried in Danville. I don't know which one. Don't even know which cemetery it is now. Haven't been able to ask anybody. Zeke Bratkowski, NFL player and coach, and John Scopes, the defendant in the monkey trials in Dayton, Tennessee. And it was an Illinois lawyer from Salem who was the prosecuting attorney. Clarence Darrow was the defense attorney of John Scopes. And trying to think the name of the lawyer that he was known as the Great Commoner, Golden Throated Orator, which I'm not right now. I'll think of his name in a minute. We'll go on. Helen Morgan, hadn't heard of her, but gave a program in Danville a week or so ago. She was listed with the Immortals of Danville. She was a jazz singer, an actress, and I read a formidable alcoholic. Stephanie White, you might have heard the name. She was the NCAA Basketball Player of the Year when she won a national championship at Purdue in 1999. Now she is the coach of the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark, so you'll see more of her. Danville is also the home of a niece's husband, Scott Harrison, and a friend of Scott's named Brian Geske, who used to attend my programs. Now you know. One other guy, Carl Lindley, founder of Watson Lake in the Yukon, the signpost forest located there. Well, it's a complicated story, and we have pretty much reached the limit. So I'm just going to suggest read about Carl Lindley, and we'll get rolling here. But I have a suggestion for you. The Wikipedia article on Bloomington or Bloomingdale has plenty of room for more notable people. In fact, they only had two names listed, and I already named half the notable people at Wikipedia list for Bloomingdale. So be inspired by the thought of one day appearing in my program. And there you go. Thanks for attending.
Well, thank you, John. Yeah, it did go longer than I expected, so I appreciate everybody who held in there. Does anybody have any questions? You can send it through to me in the Q&A section. There were a lot of things that you went over. I have relatives, west near Macomb and Galesburg, etc. So I learned a lot about them. So that was very cool. And I can tell you that I've been to Quincy. I remember Quincy very well in Nauvoo. And I've done a lot of traveling personally, so it was nice. It was a nice um, it was very nice to see this stuff.
Well, thank you. And
Does anybody have any questions?
there's tons of Illinois material out there, and I always pack everything in there and then don't have quite enough time to do it all. So we
Oh,
knock a few things.
somebody raised their hand. Diane, if you can send your question to the Q&A section, that'd be great.
And if people have suggestions of people that I might not know about that they find interesting, uh, yeah, I may not know about it. So let me know if you have a suggestion out there. Every town that you go to, somebody from there has done something. And the bigger town it is, the more of them. And, I can only mention a few, but I'm a big rooter of people from small towns. Uh, we have a situation in Peoria where one of ours is being considered for sainthood. Bishop Fulton Sheen was born in El Paso but went to school in Peoria. And I mean, the idea that we could have a saint from Peoria, and I'm just thrilled that we have a pope from Illinois, for crying out loud, from Dalton, Illinois. Not exactly a small town that I would normally uh, be traveling to, but I just think that's a real hoot. The guy is a White Sox fan and all
Mhm.
that. Yeah, I love it when
It's fabulous.
yeah.
Okay, so Diane says, do you or will you have other presentations like from Northern Illinois where I lived? Wildwood was the former estate of Mr. Sears of Sears and Roebuck.
Which is telling me something I didn't know. I've been through Wildwood. It's been a number of years, and I think I just got the picture of the sign entering town, and I haven't been back through there, so I need to do that. It's near Crystal Lake or someplace, isn't it? What's
Yeah, it sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right.
yeah.
Mm.
So I did not know that uh, Sears had property out there of the sort. So I will check into that, and you bet I want to tell that story
Fabulous.
along with all the others that I want to tell.
All right, well, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this particularly long and very fruitful presentation. If you have any other questions, my name is Kelly Knight at the library. You can always forward them to me, knight@mybpl.org, and I can send them along to John. Once again, thanks a lot and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.